In the dim corridors of history, buried beneath layers of redacted files and forgotten testimonies, lie truths that were never meant to see the light of day. The Second World War was not only a battlefield of tanks, bombers, and infantry divisions. It was a war of shadows, deception, and clandestine agreements sealed behind closed doors. Official histories speak of clear lines between friend and foe, but the archives whisper something different, of betrayals, secret transfers, and atrocities erased for the sake of power. In dusty intelligence files stamped classified and top secret, the fragments tell a darker story, one in which alliances shifted like smoke, and human lives were traded as though they were currency. From Soviet trains carrying prisoners to their deaths, to Allied briefings that concealed the horrors of Auschwitz, to US deals with Japanese war criminals in exchange for forbidden data, and finally, to the betrayal of millions under Operation Keelhaul. These suppressed episodes reveal a world where morality was sacrificed at the altar of strategy. What follows is not the war taught in classrooms or celebrated in victory parades, but the one hidden in shadows, preserved only in coded telegrams, declassified fragments, and the reluctant testimonies of those who survived. To unseal these files is to glimpse into the abyss of forbidden history, where the victors wrote not only the future, but also buried the sins they could never allow the world to know. And yet here, those buried truths surface once again. Chapter 1. The Secret Soviet-German Prisoner Transfers. On the night of January 17, 1940, in the icy border town of Brest-Litovsk, a train pulled into the station under armed escort. Its windows were blacked out, its cargo not soldiers or weapons, but men and women, shackled and silent. German guards in field grey uniforms handed over their charges to the waiting NKVD officers, whose long coats and fur hats could not conceal the unmistakable red stars on their caps. In the official ledgers, this was recorded under a bland designation: transfer of political elements under bilateral protocol. In truth, it was part of a series of secret prisoner exchanges between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, conducted under the cover of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that saw lives handed over to certain death. This cooperation is documented in fragments that survive across both Gestapo and NKVD archives. File number 32740, once stored in Berlin and later recovered in the ruins of Gestapo headquarters, lists the names of dozens of German communists who had fled to the Soviet Union seeking refuge from Hitler's purge. Believing they had escaped one tyrant, they found themselves betrayed. Stalin's secret police delivered them back into Gestapo custody, where many vanished into Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, or the coal dungeons of Prince Albrecht Strasse. In return, the NKVD demanded the extradition of Polish officers, intellectuals, and political leaders who had fallen into German hands during the partition of Poland. These men, often educated in Warsaw or Krakow, were destined for the execution pits of Katyn, Kharkiv, and Kalinin, their bodies left in mass graves hidden beneath the forests. The operation carried code names whispered across intelligence files. Operation Conceal, Directive 237, Transfer B. Soviet border records from the town of Przemysl reveal columns of guarded trucks moving at night, headlights dimmed, carrying prisoners to handover. Points along the Bug River. German field reports describe exchange trains where prisoners were unloaded and marched across bridges, under the gaze of both SS Totenkopfverbände and Red Army sentries. The official paperwork referred to these individuals as undesirables, but the reality was far more sinister. They were political exiles, refugees, and captured soldiers, abandoned by the regimes they thought they opposed. For the Soviet Union, this cooperation was pragmatic. By surrendering German communists, Stalin rid himself of potential dissenters who might question his purges or his fragile alliance with Hitler. For Nazi Germany, returning Polish officers and anti-Soviet activists meant eliminating the seeds of resistance in territories already under occupation. Both regimes, though sworn ideological enemies, acted with cold precision, exchanging human lives like playing cards in a high-stakes game of power. Among the most disturbing documents is a memorandum signed by Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, dated March 5, 1940. In it, Beria approved the transfer of thousands of Polish officers captured at Kozelsk, Starobelsk and Ostashkov camps into Soviet custody. 3 weeks later, these men were executed with a bullet to the back of the head in the forests of Katyn. The Soviet Union would deny responsibility for decades, blaming the Nazis until declassified files in 1990 confirmed the grim truth. Yet what is rarely mentioned is that some of these officers were originally detained by German forces and handed over under the secret clauses of the pact. Their fates were sealed not only by Stalin's orders, but also by Berlin's silent compliance. British and American intelligence caught glimpses of these exchanges. Mi-6 intercepts from Stockholm reported unusual train movements across the German-Soviet demarcation line, while Polish government-in-exile representatives warned London that officers were vanishing after being released from German custody. But in 1940, Britain was fighting for survival, and such intelligence was filed away with little action. Later, during the Cold War, these fragments were classified and suppressed, buried under the weight of diplomatic necessity. The human dimension of these transfers emerges from survivor testimonies. A Polish officer, Captain Andrzej Czapski, later recalled seeing comrades marched away by German guards, only to reappear under Soviet control days later, confused and terrified. German communist refugees, such as Margaret Buber-Neumann, were seized by the NKVD, delivered to the Gestapo at Brest-Litovsk, and imprisoned in Ravensbrück. Her memoir, later smuggled out, described the moment of betrayal with haunting clarity. "We were lined up on the platform. The Soviets shook hands with the Gestapo men, and we were pushed into their trucks like cattle. Our lives had been traded in silence." The secrecy of these operations was deliberate. Official communiqué between Moscow and Berlin referred only to prisoner regulation measures. Railway schedules were coded under freight designations. Guard units were rotated to ensure no soldier witnessed more than one transfer. When the pact finally collapsed in June 1941, following Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, both sides destroyed records, but not all traces vanished. In 1946, during the Nuremberg trials, Soviet prosecutors carefully avoided mentioning these exchanges, even as German officials hinted at cooperation. The silence was calculated. Neither side wished to expose the depths of their early collaboration. Today, the fragments that survive in declassified archives force us to confront a darker truth about the war. The image of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as sworn enemies ignores the years when they cooperated in carving up Eastern Europe, trading resources, intelligence, and human lives. Behind the rhetoric of ideology lay a shared understanding. Power was preserved not through principle, but through ruthless pragmatism. The silent trains of 1939 and 1940 carried more than prisoners. They carried the weight of betrayal, the evidence of collaboration, and the shadows of crimes both regimes sought to bury. Each document stamped "secret," and each testimony whispered decades later reveals not just the brutality of two dictatorships, but the terrifying efficiency with which they could align when it suited their goals. In the end, the victims were nameless to their captors, recorded only in file numbers and coded telegrams. Yet their suffering endures, etched into the cold, classified history of a war far darker than the official record admits. Chapter 2: Allied Knowledge of Auschwitz Atrocities. The story of Auschwitz is often told as if the world was blind to its horrors until the war's end, when liberating soldiers stumbled upon the barbed wire and the skeletal remains of humanity. Yet buried in intelligence archives across London and Washington is evidence that Allied leaders knew far earlier and in greater detail than they ever admitted. Declassified memoranda, Enigma decrypts, and resistance reports reveal that by 1942, the machinery of mass murder was neither hidden nor unknowable. It was documented, intercepted, and deliberately shelved under classifications that kept it from public awareness. The earliest signs appear in intercepted German communications. In March 1942, Bletchley Park cryptanalysts decrypted Luftwaffe flight records describing chemical transports under the code Action Höss, named after Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz. These flights, originating from IG Farben's chemical plants, were destined for installations near Oświęcim, a small Polish town already scarred by war. The intercepts described the delivery of Zyklon B, a pesticide not intended for agriculture but special treatment of prisoners. Reports flagged the unusual volume of deliveries, but within the corridors of MI-14, Britain's military intelligence section specializing in Eastern Europe, such documents were stamped eyes only and filed in cabinets under lock and key. At the same time, aerial reconnaissance revealed unsettling patterns. Royal Air Force reconnaissance flights over Silesia, tasked primarily with tracking industrial production, captured images of Auschwitz from high altitude. The photographs showed long rows of barracks, newly constructed rail spurs, and a sprawling complex of buildings with unusual chimneys. Analysts noted the anomalies but marked the images inconclusive, redirecting attention to IG Farben's Buna synthetic rubber plant. Later re-examinations, decades after the war, identified unmistakable features: crematoria, guard towers, and gas chamber structures clearly visible in the frames. At the time, however, the decision was not to act. Perhaps the most chilling evidence came through human couriers. Jan Karski, a courier for the Polish underground, risked his life infiltrating the Warsaw Ghetto and later a transit camp feeding into Auschwitz. His 1942 testimony, delivered directly to the British Foreign Office and later to US officials, described in painstaking detail the extermination process: sealed trains, gas chambers disguised as showers, bodies burned in open pits. His words were recorded, yet officials responded with skepticism. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden noted in one briefing that such reports were difficult to verify and might be exaggerated by exiled governments for political gain. In Washington, Karski met with President Roosevelt in July 1943, recounting the horrors with the same urgency. But the president listened in silence, asking only about the condition of horses in occupied Poland. OSS files, now declassified, reveal that Allied intelligence weighed the possibility of striking Auschwitz by air. In late 1944, as US bombers pounded German oil refineries, requests emerged from Jewish organizations and resistance leaders to target the railway lines leading to Birkenau. Aerial planners at the Pentagon debated the feasibility. Internal memoranda argued that destroying the tracks would be temporary at best, as the Germans could repair them within days. Others warned that revealing the true reason for such an attack would risk exposing Ultra, the Allies' most secret code-breaking success. The decision ultimately was silence. The camps were left untouched, even as B-24 bombers flew within striking distance, destroying factories only a few miles away. Historians long debated whether the Allies could have known. The declassified files now answer that question. They did know. Mi-6 and OSS operatives intercepted reports from the Polish Home Army, detailing the steady extermination of Jews, Roma, and political prisoners. Soviet intelligence, though distrusted by the West, broadcast radio communiques as early as 1942, describing mass killings in occupied Poland. Even the Vatican received diplomatic cables from clergy who witnessed deportations, yet chose discretion to avoid angering the Reich. The web of knowledge was wide, but the will to act was absent. Why did the Allies remain silent? The answer lies in cold calculation. For Britain, revealing too much about intercepted German communications risked compromising Ultra, the code-breaking project that gave Churchill advanced knowledge of German operations. For the United States, diverting resources to bomb rail lines or crematoria was seen as strategically irrelevant to ending the war. Saving lives in the cruel arithmetic of high command was weighed against the risk of lengthening the conflict. Even within Jewish advocacy groups, pleas were sidelined by officials who feared accusations of fighting a Jewish war. One of the most disturbing documents, unearthed in the US National Archives, is a War Department memo from November 1944. It acknowledges receipt of detailed maps of Auschwitz drawn by escapees Rudolf Werber and Alfred Wetzler, who fled the camp and delivered their testimony to the Slovak resistance. The memo notes, accuracy and credibility of sources appear high, but concludes with the chilling phrase, "No further action recommended at this time." For the prisoners still inside, those words sealed their fate. The moral weight of these decisions emerged only after the war, when images of Auschwitz stunned the world. At Nuremberg, Allied prosecutors emphasized the scale of Nazi atrocities, yet carefully avoided acknowledging how much was already known years before liberation. The narrative crafted was one of ignorance shattered by discovery, not knowledge buried by secrecy. Survivors who later testified before tribunals often wondered aloud why no help came, why the rail lines were never bombed, why the world seemed deaf. The answer lay not in ignorance, but in documents stamped secret and filed away in secure cabinets. Today, with archives unsealed, the image of Auschwitz is reframed. It was not hidden in fog, not entirely invisible to reconnaissance planes or codebreakers. It stood in plain view, documented in flight logs, captured in photographs, described in testimonies. What kept it in silence was not lack of evidence, but a deliberate choice to subordinate human lives to strategic priorities. The Allies, fighting a war for freedom, chose in this instance not to act on what they knew, allowing the machinery of death to continue its work uninterrupted. The legacy of this silence is haunting. Every decrypted message, every aerial photograph, every ignored testimony is a reminder that knowledge alone does not compel action. It raises an unsettling truth that even in the face of undeniable evidence, governments may choose secrecy, calculation, and expediency over humanity. In the long corridors of intelligence headquarters, the cries of Auschwitz were heard, but locked away behind doors marked "Eyes Only," they never reached the world in time. Chapter 3: Japan's Unit 731 and US Immunity Deals. In the frozen wastelands of Manchuria, hidden behind barbed wire and guarded by the elite of the Kwantung Army, there existed a facility so secret that even many senior Japanese officers had no idea of its true purpose. Officially, it was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. In reality, it was Unit 731, a sprawling complex near Harbin, where human beings were reduced to test subjects in the most grotesque biological and chemical warfare experiments ever recorded. Between 1936 and 1945, thousands of Chinese civilians, Korean forced laborers, Soviet prisoners of war, and even captured Allied soldiers were subjected to vivisections, frostbite tests, plague injections, and the release of experimental bombs designed to spread cholera, anthrax, and bubonic plague. The man who oversaw this nightmare was General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant yet monstrous figure whose obsession with biological warfare led to atrocities on a scale that rivals the darkest pages of Nazi Germany's medical crimes. Testimonies from surviving Japanese medical staff, unearthed in Soviet war crimes tribunals, describe a place where morality was stripped away entirely. Prisoners were called maruta, or logs, stripped of humanity, referred to as objects to be studied. In one chilling account, a prisoner was deliberately infected with plague, dissected alive without anesthesia to observe the spread of disease through the organs. In another, victims were tied to stakes in open fields, bombed with porcelain shells filled with fleas carrying bubonic plague. The results were recorded in meticulous detail, logged in notebooks and typed reports later designated as data packages. The victims were burned in pits afterward, their ashes dumped into the nearby Songhua River. Official Japanese army reports referred to these deaths not as murders, but as experimental outcomes. When the Japanese Empire collapsed in August 1945, Soviet forces advanced swiftly into Manchuria, capturing remnants of Unit 731. At the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in December 1949, the Soviets presented horrifying testimony and evidence, including photographs, captured documents, and statements from Japanese staff. The trials confirmed what many feared, that the Japanese military had waged biological warfare not only in laboratories but on battlefields, releasing plague-infected fleas over Chinese villages, poisoning wells, and deploying cholera against civilians. Yet, while the Soviets documented these crimes extensively, the Western Allies remained disturbingly silent. The reason, revealed decades later in declassified US files, was a secret arrangement that effectively erased the crimes of Unit 731 from Western public memory. Documents from Fort Detrick, Maryland, the hub of America's biological warfare program, prove that US intelligence officers made direct contact with General Ishii and his subordinates in late 1945 under the code name Project Black. Umbrella. American officials negotiated immunity for Unit 731 personnel in exchange for their research data. Instead of facing execution or imprisonment for war crimes, Ishii and his team were quietly resettled, their findings flown across the Pacific and locked away in classified files. A 1947 memorandum from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters explicitly states, "Data on human experimentation deemed of utmost value to US biological warfare program. Immunity authorized. Do not release to Soviet Union." The victims of Harbin, nameless and faceless in official reports, had their suffering bartered for military advantage in the emerging Cold War. The scope of the data was staggering. Reports covered everything from the effects of frostbite on the human body, tested by exposing prisoners to sub-zero temperatures until their limbs froze solid, to the survivability of plague under different environmental conditions. Detailed charts mapped how long anthrax spores remained lethal when released by ceramic bombs. Hand-drawn diagrams illustrated internal organs ravaged by cholera, dissected from still living prisoners. To the US military, these findings represented years of experimentation that could not ethically or legally be replicated. The decision was clear. These atrocities would be buried, not prosecuted, because the data was considered unique and irreplaceable. The Soviets, enraged by being denied access to this research, accused the United States of a deliberate cover-up. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, Soviet prosecutors attempted to bring forward evidence of Unit 731, but American representatives blocked much of it, declaring the material not relevant. Instead, lesser-known Japanese officials were prosecuted, while Ishii and his core team disappeared from the dock. Incredibly, Ishii lived out his life in Japan, reportedly working as a consultant for American biological research before dying quietly in 1959. Other Unit 731 doctors went on to prominent careers in post-war Japan, some even rising to respected positions in universities and hospitals. Their victims, meanwhile, remained voiceless, erased from history by classified agreements. The survivors of Japanese biological warfare, however, bore witness in their bodies. Villages in Zhejiang and Hunan provinces continued to suffer outbreaks of plague and cholera for years after the war, remnants of Japan's weaponized pathogens that spread uncontrollably. Families of Allied POWs captured in Singapore and sent to Manchuria to be used as test subjects never received confirmation of their fates. The US government, in possession of files detailing these crimes, maintained silence, unwilling to reveal the truth and risk exposing the immunity deals. Only in the 1980s and 1990s, as researchers in Japan uncovered long-hidden documents and testimonies, did fragments of the story re-emerge. Among the most haunting discoveries were the handwritten experiment logs, preserved by chance in forgotten storerooms. One notebook, marked with the Unit 731 seal, detailed frostbite experiments in Harbin during the winter of 1941. Prisoners were left outside in temperatures reaching -30°C until their limbs froze solid. Warm water was then poured over the affected areas to observe how tissue would react. The results were noted clinically, without any acknowledgement of the victim's agony. Another document described Project Maruta 12, involving plague bombs tested on entire villages, with estimated casualty numbers recorded in columns. These documents, cold and precise, stripped away the last illusions of denial. In the United States, declassified CIA and Army files confirm that the immunity deal was not an isolated case, but part of a broader pattern of absorbing enemy knowledge regardless of its moral cost. Just as Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to America, Project Black Umbrella ensured that Unit 731's horrors would become a foundation for US biological warfare programs. For decades, the victims of Harbin were denied even recognition, their suffering erased to protect the reputations of those who bargained with war criminals. The silence lasted so long that many survivors died before ever hearing an admission of the truth. The legacy of Unit 731 is therefore not only the crimes committed in Harbin, but also the deliberate choice by world powers to bury them. It is the story of how atrocities were weighed against strategic advantage and found expendable. It is the story of how men who presided over vivisections and plague bombings were allowed to retire in peace, while their victims' bones lay in unmarked pits. And it is the story of how the Cold War, with its hunger for knowledge and power, created a climate where even the most horrific crimes could be overlooked if they served national interest. The documents that survive in Soviet archives, American repositories, and hidden Japanese collections paint a consistent picture. Unit 731 was not an aberration lost to chaos, but a carefully concealed chapter of the war. To read these files is to confront the disturbing truth that justice was deliberately denied, sacrificed at the altar of science and strategy. The ghosts of Harbin still linger, in rivers once poisoned by experiments, in villages scarred by disease, and in the pages of classified reports stamped secret decades after the guns of World War II fell silent. Chapter 4: Operation Keelhaul and Forced Repatriations. As the guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945, millions of displaced persons wandered the shattered continent, prisoners of war, refugees, civilians who had fled the front lines, and soldiers who had fought under banners now condemned. For many, the Allied victory promised liberation. Yet in secret meeting rooms and classified agreements, another fate was being sealed. Known euphemistically as Operation Keelhaul, the forced repatriation program became one of the darkest betrayals of the war's aftermath. Between 1945 and 1947, under the authority of secret protocols agreed by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, millions of men, women, and children were forcibly returned to the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. The Allies knew full well that for many, repatriation meant execution, imprisonment in the Gulag, or exile to Siberian labor camps. It was a betrayal buried beneath the triumph of victory, recorded only in obscure military files and testimonies from those who survived. The scale was immense. British War Office files WO 204-4274 describe camps in Austria and northern Italy, where tens of thousands of Cossacks, white émigrés and anti-Soviet refugees were assembled under armed guard. In one such camp near Lienz, Austria, the British 8th Army oversaw the surrender of entire Cossack families, men who had fought alongside German units, their wives and children. Believing they would be resettled in the West, they instead found themselves herded into trucks and trains bound east. When they realized their true destination, panic erupted. Eyewitness reports describe desperate suicides along the railway platforms, mothers drowning their children in the nearby Drava River, officers slashing their own throats with knives smuggled into camp, groups choosing death over Soviet captivity. The British officers, following orders, stood by in silence, some weeping, others averting their eyes. Their official reports used phrases like disorderly behavior during transfer, masking the horror in sterile language. The Americans too complied. SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, issued directives mandating the return of Soviet citizens regardless of their personal wishes. In Bavaria, US troops surrounded camps filled with Russian émigrés, many of whom had fled Russia decades earlier during the revolution. Families pleaded, showing papers proving they had never held Soviet citizenship. Yet under the terms of the Yalta Agreement, the definition of Soviet national was expanded to include anyone of Russian origin, even those born outside Stalin's borders. They were marched to railway stations, handed over to NKVD units, waiting just beyond the demarcation line. Reports confirm many were shot on arrival, others shipped in cattle cars to the Gulag archipelago. The cruelty was not ignorance, it was deliberate policy, enforced with cold efficiency. In the Balkans, the nightmare deepened. Yugoslav leader Josip Broz Tito demanded the return of anti-communist fighters, particularly the Chetniks and Slovenian Home Guard who had resisted his rise. British intelligence, under pressure to maintain relations with Tito's partisan government, delivered thousands of prisoners. In Kočevski Rog, Slovenia, mass executions followed, carried out in hidden forests where victims were shot and their bodies thrown into caves sealed with explosives. Local villagers later spoke of hearing muffled cries from beneath the earth for days afterward. The British liaison officers who handed the men over recorded nothing in their reports, their silence bought by political necessity. The secret of Operation Keelhaul was preserved by euphemism. Official communiques spoke of repatriation and resettlement, never acknowledging the violence that followed. When soldiers expressed unease, their superiors reminded them of the Yalta Accords and the need to maintain unity with the Soviet Union against the looming threat of post-war instability. In private letters, some officers confessed their guilt. One British captain wrote to his wife, "We have betrayed these poor souls into the hands of their executioners. I fear history will judge us harshly, though I suspect the truth will never be told." His letter, intercepted by censors, was filed away and classified, marked with the red stamp, Secret Soviet Archives. Opened briefly in the 1990s, confirmed the grim fate of many returnees. NKVD files list entire convoys delivered by British and American troops, their names recorded, followed by notations of execution or 10 years corrective labor. In one chilling entry, dated July 1945, a group of 2,546 Cossacks handed over near Judenburg were processed within 2 weeks. The file concludes with a single word: liquidated. Western governments, long aware of such outcomes, maintained silence, fearing public outrage and the political fallout of exposing the betrayal. For decades, Operation Keelhaul remained one of the least discussed aspects of the war. The Cold War provided both excuse and cover. The West needed the Soviet Union as both ally and adversary. and the stories of betrayed refugees threatened the fragile narrative of Allied unity. Survivors who managed to escape the transports often found no audience for their testimony. When they spoke of British or American troops handing them to NKVD officers, listeners dismissed their accounts as exaggeration or anti-Soviet propaganda. Only in the 1970s, with the publication of Nicholas Bethel's exposé, The Last Secret, did the broader public begin to glimpse the truth. Even then, many details remained locked in classified archives, and governments downplayed the scale. The emotional toll endures in survivor communities. Among Cossack diaspora families in North America, the memory of Lienz is preserved as a day of mourning. Annual commemorations recall the betrayal, with candles lit for mothers who drowned their children to spare them the Gulag. In Eastern Europe, newly uncovered mass graves testify to the scale of executions carried out after forced repatriations. The skeletons, often bound with wire, bear silent witness to the brutality of Operation Keelhaul. Each discovery confirms what survivors long claimed, that liberation in 1945 was, for millions, the beginning of a new nightmare. The moral stain of Operation Keelhaul lies not only in the deaths themselves, but in the deliberate concealment. Governments that celebrated victory over tyranny also ensured that the truth of their complicity would be hidden. Official histories omitted the forced repatriations, presenting the end of the war as a moment of universal liberation. The documents, when finally released, told a different story, of betrayal, of silence, of orders carried out in the name of expedience. The victims, betrayed under Allied uniforms, were consigned to darkness both in life and in memory. In the end, Operation Keelhaul reminds us that the lines between victor and vanquished, liberator and betrayer, were not as clear as official histories suggest. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the triumph of 1945 was shadowed by secret agreements and moral compromises. The displaced persons who believed they had escaped tyranny found themselves marched back into its embrace, their lives sacrificed to the fragile alliance that held the post-war order together. The documents that survive are fragments, but they are enough to reveal the truth. Liberation was not universal, and for millions, the war's end was only the beginning of another nightmare. In the hidden margins of World War II, the darkest truths were not found only on the battlefields or in the ruins of cities, but in the shadows where governments bartered, concealed, and silenced. From the silent trains rolling across the Bug River, delivering prisoners into the hands of executioners, to the classified intelligence files that recorded Auschwitz's horrors, yet kept them from the world, to the grotesque bargains made with Japan's Unit 731 in exchange for forbidden knowledge, and finally to the betrayal of millions under Operation Keelhaul. The war's true legacy is layered with secrets buried for decades. These were not accidents of history, but deliberate choices made behind closed doors, where strategy outweighed morality and alliances demanded silence. Even today, many archives remain sealed, many names erased, many graves unmarked. What has surfaced are fragments, coded telegrams, redacted memoranda, survivor testimonies that escaped censorship. Together, they reveal a disturbing reality, that victory itself was built on foundations of compromise, deception, and betrayal. The official story of World War II is one of liberation and triumph. The hidden story, however, tells of lives sacrificed in secret, of truths concealed from the public, of crimes traded for advantage in the new order of the Cold War. And so the question lingers, unanswered and unresolved. What else still lies locked away in the archives, waiting to surface? What hidden agreements, what suppressed atrocities, remain buried beneath the dust of classified files, waiting for the day when silence can no longer hold them?